any previous situation. Just stand my ground, that is resistance. That doesn't take me anywhere forward. It doesn't take me an inch forward, literally speaking. Yeah. A movement is something that pushes for something. On the other hand, we have very interesting movements. An anti-fascist movement, an anti-discrimination movement, an anti-this and an anti-that, but we very seldom have movements for something. We are moving, but we are moving in a sort of resistance mode. Let me explain. So we call it a movement, and definitely there's a movement. The Women's March was the indication of a movement when Donald Trump took office. But where was it going? What was for? Don't tell me what was against. That we all know. But what exactly was for? Nobody really knows. There's no defined agenda. And you can put 250,000 people in the streets, and you can put 500,000 and 1 million people in the streets, and when that people are just marching, but they don't have a clear strategy, a clear analysis, and a clear agenda, a clear set of demands. And when I mean strategy, I really mean it. What exactly and up to where you are willing to go in order to get your agenda, that's part of the strategy. 2006, immigration marches. May 1st, 2006, we put 1 million people in the street on that day, right here in the city of Chicago. And we were asking for not an immigration revolution, we were asking for immigration reform. And what happened? Well, that huge, immense movement got sold out because we were just marching for something we called immigration reform without details, without knowing who to negotiate it with, how to negotiate it with anyone we found willing to negotiate anything, whether it was President Bush or McCain or Kennedy, Senator Kennedy. It doesn't matter who, the Democrats or Republicans. We didn't have it as part of our strategy to negotiate anything. We just demanded immigration reform. Nowadays, Donald Trump calls for immigration reform. For him, it means a wall in the border, it means to double the number of immigration agents, and it means a whole bunch of other considerations like that. Our immigration reform is not his immigration reform. Yeah, and that's a problem with terminology and lack of clarity on the principles of any movement. We can have a big movement, a gigantic movement, we can push forward, but if we don't know where are we pushing, at what pace, and et cetera, we don't go anywhere. And that's the way I think, forget about the reforms, revolutionary movements have been lost. Several revolutionary movements have ended up in nothing because there wasn't a clear agenda, because there wasn't a strategy, because it wasn't clear how to get there. And I'm referring particularly to some Latin American countries, where there were huge reforms, huge, really changing the system in so many ways. Not the basic capitalism as such, but reforming the whole system in a way that they believed would allow them to change the capitalist system. But they have not gone so far. They have not been able to get so far. Bolivia, Ecuador, Argentina, and Chile, with up and downs and several. So that's, I think, what we have to discuss. And at some point we have to agree on these movements are worth it to participate on, or should we look for something else, or should we participate but by making very clear the direction of the movement, the agenda the movement should have. Where is the Black Lives Matter movement going? Is it negotiating anything? Is it not? What's the combination with the immigration movement or not? What is the immigration movement? How reformist it is? The immigration movement, far as I know, and believe you me, I know, I am in the middle of it, is just asking for a simple bureaucratic change. The number of visas the United States issues to immigrants so they can live here legally. And that's it. That's not a revolutionary movement by any means. And we can put 1 million people in the street again, maybe sometime. Yeah, but the objective is just a slight change in one of the hundreds of laws in the United States. That's not revolutionary. Now, I don't feel disappointed with my life. I'm not doing anything revolutionary right now, unless you believe, like I do, that everything you do and every participation and every talk and speech and whatnot, is part of a larger, the larger idea that we have to educate ourselves a little bit. We have to transmit our knowledge. We have to provoke discussion, and we have to get somewhere at some point. I don't know where, but I don't have it very clear myself, of course. But if you believe that everything we do in our lives, and you dedicate your lives to do, that push forward and that education and that exchange of ideas and opinions and whatnot, if you believe that tends in the long run to create a better environment for a possible revolution or a deep reform, then I think you shouldn't be disappointed yourselves either. I think that's enough to open. Thank you.
Okay. First I would like to thank Platypus for organizing this event, and I would like to thank my co-panelists and all of you for coming out on such a cold night. My name is Nate. I'm a paralegal at a small law firm, and I am a member of the Socialist Party USA, or SPUSA, and I'm also a member of the Platypus Affiliated Society. I should be clear, though, that I am not representing the SPUSA officially, nor am I representing Platypus. I'm going to try to respond to the panel topic by talking about my experience on the left within and through these two very different organizations. I'll be expressing my own views, not theirs. However, you would be correct to attribute anything insightful I might happen to say to the influence of these organizations and my comrades in them, and anything stupid I might say you should attribute to me alone. I joined the SPUSA a bit less than a year ago. The SPUSA is a daughter organization of the Socialist Party of America, founded by Eugene V. Debs and others in 1901, in the shadow of the defeat of the nationwide railway workers' strike spearheaded by the American Railway Union, which was also led by Debs. In the early 1970s, the Socialist Party of America split three ways, with one branch becoming the Social Democrats USA, another becoming the Socialist Party USA, and another one becoming the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, which later merged with the New American Movement and became the DSA, Democratic Socialists of America. What drew me to the SPUSA was both its deep history, the fact that its parent organization under Debs' leadership was a bona fide socialist party in this country, and the fact that currently, as the SPUSA, it remains committed to building a multi-tendency socialist party independent of and fighting against both the Democratic and the Republican parties. If you're interested in learning more about that, or more about the SPUSA, you can speak with me after the event. So I joined the SPUSA a bit less than a year ago, and I was prompted to do so by Trump's election. But I had a somewhat peculiar reaction to the events of November last year. I wanted to get involved not simply to oppose Trump, which can just mean trying to get Democrats elected. It seemed to me that the two-party system, as we knew it, was in a moment of crisis. Despite their many differences, the Tea Party movement and Occupy Wall Street both signaled growing discontent with the established leadership of the Democratic and Republican parties. This discontent erupted again in 2016, posing the question, to my mind at least, of the need for an independent party fighting for socialism. Now, this brings up the question of Trump and the anti-racist and anti-fascist politics opposed to him. I would certainly classify these protests and mobilizations in terms of resistance. Individuals involved may have more or less radical or far-reaching political aspirations, but on the whole, these new mobilizations are seeking a return, by and large, to the status quo ante, Democratic Party rule. Many who have participated in these protests would be quick to denounce the Democratic Party and take exception to the Democrats' supposed attempts to co-opt the movement. To that, I would say that it is the responsibility of the left to distinguish itself from the Republicans and the Democrats and to fight for an independent political movement. I would also raise the example of the movement against the war in Iraq. Many of the leftist organizers involved had a deeper and more expansive vision for society, perhaps, rather than just turning over the war machine to the Democratic Party. And yet, the movement they helped to build was, on the whole, based on anti-Bushism. When Obama took office, it took the winds out of the sails of the anti-war movement for that reason. So that would be a point of reference for the perils of resistance. I'll try to now address the topic of reform and revolution. First, I'd give a quick note about revolution that was kind of inspired by the quote from Engels, that you don't need Marx or Engels, you don't need Lenin, you don't need any 20th century figure, or you don't need any other 20th century figure or anything, to find a robust defense of the people's right to overthrow a government that has become tyrannical. You don't have to go further to the left than Mark Twain, in fact. What Marx and Engels and those who followed in the tradition sought to do was clarify what the tasks of democratic revolution became in light of history, specifically the tasks of revolution in the age of heavy industry, monopolization, and imperialism. Now, the classic treatment of the question of reform or revolution is, of course, Luxemburg's Reform or Revolution, in which Luxemburg argues that it is only reformists who divide the matter into an either-or. In other words, both reformists and revolutionaries pursue reforms, but the latter do so in order to prepare politically for revolution, whereas reformists liquidate the goal of revolution. Luxemburg could make this argument, I believe, because in the early 1900s, the Second International and the SPD in Germany in particular was, or at least seemed to be, simultaneously winning demands politically while also building independent socialist parties internationally that could plausibly spearhead revolution. Only about 10 years later, the matter would not be so clear, as the SPD itself voted for war credits in England in World War I. Indeed, over the course of the 20th century, it appears that meaningful reforms were bought or achieved at the expense of the political independence of the left and, therefore, at the expense of revolutionary possibilities. And now, today, when the left has very little, if any, independent political life, even meaningful reform doesn't really seem to be on the table. So we were left with different kinds of sub-reformism, we call it. And I would link that to something that was brought up in the panel description about kind of politics becoming a sort of moral posture. So in closing, I just simply say that I believe consciousness of the history of the left is necessary, and that's why I'm in Platypus. However, I don't think we can assume or act as if that history, the tradition of the left, matters. It must be made to matter again. And I think that will only happen when an independent political party of the left is rebuilt, mostly, if not entirely, from scratch. And that's why I'm in the SPUSA.
Thank you, and thank you again for inviting me and for organizing this panel. Thanks, Josh, for suggesting that I come on here. When Josh invited me to come on this panel, my name is Sam, and I was represented as somebody named Spark. He asked me because I am an orthodox Trotskyist. I'll try to defend that position as best I can. So, in that light, I want to pick up on where my two esteemed panelists left off, and I don't think that we disagree about much of what's been said so far. But I think that the key place where I would start my analysis is with class. And I actually think that there's a problem in the way that these questions get posed with a left-right divide. And I think this actually was revealed in some ways by the election of Trump. Because I think for a long time, the left has essentially ignored that capitalism is about exploitation, and that the fundamental dynamic of capitalism is to extract wealth from workers, and that workers have the possibility to resist that, and maybe to make a revolution, or at least with reforms, or improve their situation, or get higher wages, fight for inclusion by organizing and fighting back. And I think the real problem is when we look to some other force in the power of the workers themselves to do that. And I think that for a long time, the left, such as it has been, at least represented in the mainstream media, which would include a lot of the Democratic Party, completely neglects that question, which is what opens the door for somebody like Trump to pose as the working class candidate. Like, on the face of it, that's kind of ridiculous, right? But if you read the newspapers, they constantly represent Trump as the working class candidate. What they mean by that, obviously, only like racist white workers or something like that. But this is a pretty big mark of the fact that there is no independent, organized force, at least on the scale of the country, that can say it's speaking in the name of the working class. And I don't think that the left, per se, has a possibility as the left to take on that mantle. So I actually think, as kind of an Orthodox practice, that the key task really is to try to spread ideas that workers can run things among workers themselves, and to raise demands, like some of the things that Jorge brought up about that we need higher wages that are pegged to inflation, and to see if people are willing to fight for that. Now, I want to raise one more related point, and this is about the question of what is a movement, which was in the whole original prompt for this discussion. I think that word is used in a very loose way, and I think that that creates a lot of problems, because I think there's a big difference between the kinds of movements we're living in now and a movement like the workers' movement in the 1930s, or what you saw in many different directions in the 1960s and 70s. And I think there are generally times in history when masses of people fight back in an uncontrolled way. We're not living in one of those times, unfortunately. So I think it's in a way a mistake to call things movements. I want to go back to what you raised about the anti-war stuff. And I remember being part of the anti-war movement when Iraq was invaded. Yes, I'm old too. And like the first day that Iraq was invaded, there were a bunch of us out there, and there were even some very big protests. And then it's true. As soon as the 2004 election started, where Kerry's main program in Iraq was to send more troops, that whole movement disappeared. Because in some ways it wasn't a movement. It was something mobilized ultimately by people who were linked to the Democratic Party. I would in some ways say the same thing about the Women's March. Yes, lots of people went out. It was clearly sparked by this pre-existing organization. Right? I know less about the inner workings of what brought people out in those big immigrant marches. I was there too. But my reading of it, my feel about it was that it was also linked to the Democratic Party. Like, I remember going there with a friend, and she was like, man, you know that your movement has been bought out when the cops are handing out water, which they were doing in that big march. Okay, the cops are kind of for that, right? Daley was for some kind of immigration reform that was basically to legalize people here, more or less. Okay, I agree, that's a reform and I'm all for it. But also, it tells you something that it can then be turned off. So, that raises a question which I see as central. What can we do to make people decide to fight for their own interests? And I think the answer is nothing. What I think we can do is, with the people that we're linked to, prepare ourselves to understand the society that we live in and the power that we have as clearly as possible. I think it is important to know the history, at least of the working movement, that's how I put it, not necessarily the left, the history of the working class. What are the mistakes it's made, like supporting war credits in World War I, if you want to talk about the German SPD? Sure, I'm all for it, I agree, that was a big mistake, disaster. Right? What are the things that people have done that were effective? What are the lessons we can learn from that? How do we see capitalism? What actually is it? What's the problem we're confronted by? What are the things that appeal to people? And in doing this, I think it's important also to recognize the limitations of the time that we're living in. When people aren't fighting back in a big way, you can have a meeting like this, which has a very interesting topic, and I think this is actually a pretty good crowd for an event like this. In a time, honestly, I'm not saying that to make fun or anything, I really do think that. And in a time period when there's a big movement going on, you would have to rent Soldier Field. We don't have to, because we don't have much influence on things. But that doesn't mean that we can't do anything. I actually very much agree with what you said. I'm not disappointed with my life at all. We live in this time period. We do what we can do, and I think what we can do right now is prepare ourselves to understand the society that we live in. Find that some people who will decide that what they want to do is actually dedicate their lives, actually, that's what it takes, to fighting back on those problems. And find a way to link yourselves with as many people as you can. I think that's actually the way that in a time period like this, the problems of reform and revolution and resistance can be related. Because in the end, somebody from the outside can't make people resist, can't force reforms, can't make a revolution. In a time period when masses of people aren't fighting back on their own interests, which is what we live in, there's only so much that we can do, but we have to do those things. Now, I'm going to say one last thing on this. I think there are times, even now, when we see little bits of sparks that you could imagine catching fire. I don't think they've done it yet. And I want to work through the one current example as a way to discuss why I talk about the working class. Let's take the example of all the abuse of women that we've seen come out in the press recently. I think it's actually instructive. Here we see this big issue which has exploded on the stage. And it's exploded particularly with people who are in prominent positions, right? You're people like Harvey Weinstein and actresses, people like all these politicians, people like the gymnastics guy. I mean, this is people who are on the public stage, essentially really middle-class people, who are able to expose an abuser or a harasser and really embarrass them, and in a position where that public exposure has some power. But think about where most of the abuse takes place in our society. It takes place in like some random farm, or at like the fast food place, where like the manager's like, you want the good shifts? Okay, but you know, so in those kind of places, how can people resist? And I think there, you see that it's going to take a different kind of exposure. You're not going to be able to fight back against that boss in the Amazon warehouse, to use a random example, by saying to people, there's an abusive boss in the Amazon warehouse. It's not going to stop people from buying their books on Amazon. I heard actually somebody say you can buy other things on Amazon. But anyway, so what would it take to actually stop that? Because you know what happens all the time, that people, working class women, stand up to an abusive or harassing boss. What it takes is people linking with their coworkers, standing up for themselves, like yelling at somebody, trying to get them fired. You can imagine many, many ways that it happens, but it requires a different kind of power and organization than simply exposing a famous dude like Harvey Weinstein or Roy Moore. This is why I think in the end, the power to change things in a collective way, to move society in a direction that takes away everything being organized for profit and pushes in a direction of saying that the needs of the population come first. The power to do that and the possibility to do that come from the nature of the way that workers are organized. Yes, it's true, we do not live in an economy where most people work in steel mills anymore, but we still live in an economy based top to bottom on the exploitation of workers. And I don't care if you're talking about Chipotle or an Amazon warehouse or a big steel mill. I don't think that that's fundamentally changed.
Okay, so now I think we're going to move into some response from the panelists. If you guys want to take 3 minutes to respond to the opening remarks from each other, starting with Jorge.
Just basically to clarify one thing, because it's very interesting. The immigration movement in 2006 was a very large, explosive, spontaneous response to something the Republicans wanted to do. They wanted to pass a horrific immigration bill. And people felt offended by it. It was a matter of respect, which is not in any law. I mean, there are no laws that I know of, the Declaration of Human Rights, but that's not a law, that says you have to be respected. You know, and a fight for respect is completely ethereal. I mean, it's abstract. But that's what happened. And it surprised the Democratic Party like hell. They didn't expect it. They were not in the organizing of the marches. They came on board in May, after the May Day, after we had marched on May Day, they sought, they looked for the way to grab this movement, and they did it in the end. I mean, it took several months to really get on the movement and start writing it. And then it went to hell, everything pretty much. That was the defeat of the immigration movement. But it was a mostly spontaneous, mostly ground level activists putting together all this. But as I was saying at the beginning, you don't have structure, you don't have resources, money, power, you don't even have a meeting hall. And that is, it defeats any kind of movement. One other point I wanted to make, the historical transformation of movements into non-government organizations or non-profit organizations. Time and again, the largest social movements become non-profit organizations sooner or later. You have the Rainbow Coalition, Jesse Jackson, and you have the now National Organization of Women, and you have all these organizations that start living off the government money, and they bring the movement to a standstill. To be an organization paying for rent and the salary of the executive director and the secretary and the receptionist and the organizers of such movement. That's a historical trend. Exceptions somehow are the labor unions, of course, but the labor unions got into another derailment, which it was corruption. We know it. I love them. I'm going to die a union member. I am a union member. I promote labor unions, but we can deny it. I mean, they are sold out. They are corrupt, many of them. But at least they are non-profit organizations. At least workers still have the chance to participate in their union and make it active, which doesn't happen very usual, but that's a tendency.
Maybe just a couple of brief points. I mean, it's something that Jorge brought up. I mean, the term movement, which I would think of as kind of a category of the masses in society, which can be very amorphous in character in terms of their political goals, etc. And I think maybe you were kind of getting at this when you were talking about the difference between a movement against something versus a movement for something. I mean, maybe another thing I would raise with that, something that you said in terms of reforms versus revolution, that the same demand could mean something very different politically. And so I would just, the kind of, what I would sort of want to say, maybe going off of that, is that obviously like the specific demands of the platform, those sorts of things are important, but that's not kind of the end-all be-all of politics. That the sort of political nature of an organization, it's about how the people in the party are organized, how the party itself tries to organize society, how it's is or isn't rooted in a particular class. But then also how it's trying to, the sort of overall context, but also how it's potentially trying to sort of like lead within society, and thus perhaps be based in the working class, but also trying to lead greater movements for democratic change. And so maybe another thing that I sort of want to interrogate or kind of push on something that you said, is that, like, so there's obviously there's like been like a lot of thinking or writing about how the working class has changed, and it's the way people are sort of organized in order to work in society is of course something that changes over time, and a lot of people think that somehow made like socialism less necessary, or what socialist politics unnecessary. I disagree with that. But obviously there have been changes. And so, I think that very specific strategies for organizing have, of course, changed, but then there's a necessity for trying to figure out how you would try to organize around demands and a platform that, is within the kind of tradition or history of the left under very changed and different circumstances. And I feel that oftentimes people were leftists will worry that the working class has been in some way bought off, or it's been bourgeoisified. I kind of feel that there's the kind of real specter over leftist politics is actually lumpen proletarianization, and that's actually other sorts of things that we're seeing. Recourse to contract labor, which is now kind of being called the gig economy, but it goes back much, much longer than that. And that poses very real challenges. The last thing I would also say is that in terms of people fighting for their interests, politically, I think what really matters is how people understand their interests. And in terms of what politics they support, they're only choosing amongst the options that are actually available to them politically. And so, it's a big turnout if, more than 50%, of people vote. And, I don't think that's not that you were saying this, but I think it's very common for people to kind of adopt this sense that people just don't know their own interests. Whereas really, their interests aren't being politically represented. And the question would be how to do that, and therefore seeing that there's such disappointment and such frustration with mainstream politics right now, that it doesn't just present an opportunity of itself, but I feel it's necessary for the left to try to make it into an opportunity. And I guess I use the term left in part because to me it's not actually I don't feel that there's a kind of specific party that exists that I can point to. I'm in the SPUSA, but it's about what it's aspiring toward, not something that immediately exists right now. And so it seems that the category of the left, at least for me, is a way of actually making sense of the political situation, that we find ourselves in today, in a way that, it would, a very different type of vocabulary might have been more applicable in, even the 60s, or the 50s, 40s, 30s, going back further. I think the kind of dividing lines were clearer, and people were organized politically in such a way that you could kind of make a finer distinction. So, in a sense, the kind of recourse to a kind of more abstract category, like the left, I feel is, it's maybe unfortunate in some respects, but I feel that it's very much rooted in the current political situation. I guess that's what I was saying with that.
Thank you both. This is interesting, actually, because I was hoping to be more that I could argue with, because it would make it more fun for people. But unfortunately, I basically agree with most of what you guys said. I guess on the question of the left, I'm going to start there because we just end with it. I do think that there is a difference between posing things in class terms and thinking of yourself as representing a certain kind of interests, and posing it in left-right terms. And so that's why I actually do think that's an important division. I don't actually think that workers don't know their interests and somehow they're voting against their interests, something like that. I agree with exactly what you said, that people choose from the interests that are expressed. And so I think the problem is that there are no working class interests politically expressed in this country in any kind of big way. Certainly my tiny group, the Spark, does not do that on the scale of Chicago, let alone the United States. And we would not pretend to be a political party even, because we're really just a little group. We're trying to build something, we're trying to push in that direction. But I don't think that exists. I have to admit something, which is that I saw what you wrote down. And it says, it's interesting, because I think it's interesting. People are cynical about politics, and I want to go off on his note. Am I allowed to do that? Anyway, I think it's problematic that people are really cynical about politics today, and I see this among many people that I talk to about politics. That I hear the attitude all the time, and I'm sure you guys do too. This is true of my students. This is true of people I talk to on the street selling my newspaper. It's true of people I meet in the working class and in middle class and student milieus. People think politics is all corrupt. Nothing can change through politics. And I think in a way we do have to fight that attitude. Like ultimately I think the three of us all kind of agree that the solution here has got to be at least in some way political. And I think that's part of the answer to your question about how the working class has changed. I completely agree with your point that I think that calling the working class of today bourgeoisified in the US is a statement that you don't know working class people because people are not experiencing bourgeoisification, right? Like even the young people in the burbs where I teach, it's like the Souls Cultural Wasteland in New Page County where he teaches too. Like they grew up, a lot of them with like working class parents, and they're stuck living at home until they're like 80 because they can't afford to get an apartment. And even if like, I'll ask them like how much you make in your job, and somebody says like $12 an hour, and he's like, oh, that's so great. And I'm like, but $12 an hour is literally below the cost of like reproducing the working class. Like $12 an hour means you're stuck living with your parents forever. Like, in just the basic terms, even when you say it's great that the minimum wage is going up to 13, it is. But come on, really. Like in Chicago, at $13 an hour, you can't actually like get a decent apartment and like a car, because the CPA kind of sucks, and like raise a kid. You just can't do that. So wages have gotten so low now, they're just below the cost of like reproducing the working class in a certain way. So in that sense, I totally agree with you. And I do think in a way the answer to that has to be in part political. The only solution is political. It's on the scale of the working class. In some ways, I think this is part of why workers today don't fight back very much. One of the reasons you don't see big strikes. We all know, I say this to students, okay, you work at Target. Why don't you guys shut down your Target? And what they say, correctly, is look, if we organize a union at our Target and demand $20 an hour, they just close that Target. That's probably true. Or at least it might be true. So even to just pass the basic bar of making a successful fight seems pretty high. You have to like shut down all the Targets. How do you go from where we are now to shutting down all the Targets? I don't know. And I think the answer is in some ways political. So I actually completely agree with what Nate said, that we have to find a way in the medium run to clearly articulate a politics that represents the interests of the working class. What that politics is kind of obvious. It doesn't require a lot of thinking, and I don't think it's very different from what it was even in like the 10 demands in the Communist Manifesto. I mean, there's some new things, but they're not that new. Like, okay, people need wages that are pegged to inflation. People need the right to a job. You need to have every person who's here, who the boss has brought here, have the same legal rights as everyone else. Like, these are not very complicated things. You need to have jobs and not mass incarceration. I mean, you need the right to an education that's equal for everyone in the country. These aren't crazy radical things, but I think to get them it would actually take a revolution. I think it would be possible to articulate these things to everybody if you had an organization on a scale that could do it. But the only way you're going to get that organization is if people start to fight in a big enough way that lots of people decide to be active. And I don't think that's going to happen because like my group, the Spark, wins like 10 more people. It's going to happen because at some point there will be in this country a big fight. And when that happens, then the question is, what are the organized forces? And today the organized forces are in fact the Democratic Party. Or they're other groups which are not pushing things in our direction. So I think today there's a task which is to build as much as we can now that can articulate clearly a kind of working class politics that can push things in an emancipatory direction if we want to use that. I don't know if that was a response to what other people said, but it does.
Thank you all. So now we're going to move into our Q&A. Josh has a mic. Ask
Okay. So I have a question about education, because I think this has come up actually in every panelist's remarks in one way or another. And so I guess broadly the question is, what is education and actually how does it happen with regards to the left and with regards to politics specifically? But to be a bit more specific and on topic, paying attention to resistance, reform and revolution, it kind of crossed my mind while I was listening to the panel that, okay, well, what do we resist? We resist things that we can learn from. Like when you're a student and you don't want to do your homework. It's because you could learn from it that you resisted, because you never resist playing a video game, right? So, you know, if we want to talk about today and the resistance today, perhaps, you know, the upshot of this is that what's being resisted, Trump, the crisis of neoliberalism, the crisis of the parties in the United States, that is something that could be learned from if one were to overcome that resistance. And so, you know, there's a question for me of how. And then, I guess, Sam, there was something I wanted to ask you a bit specifically, because I found it, sorry, a bit odd, just to me, it kind of struck me, how you were talking about spreading ideas amongst the workers, educating people, and the question of interest, right? That you can't show people their interests, which in some sense is true. You can't go up to someone and say, this is your interest, now do what I say, because this will like get you to realize your interest. And then on another level, people are in a way already kind of fighting for their interests, maybe, right? You could say, okay, well, you know, I'm voting for Trump because I think I'll get a tax cut or something. Somebody could say that, and that is technically their interest. Or, you know, unions can say, well, we have to be in the Democratic Party, we can't leave. Right, that is kind of in their interests. But I think a response that I would expect from, like, for example, Trotsky would be that, well, there is still a task, right? Like, he still did believe in this task of the Second International and then the Third International, and then, like, later, I guess, the Fourth International, that one could, through politics, somehow lead, right, the masses or the workers, the working class, to fight for their ultimate interest, which is overcoming capital. And so I guess I wanted to kind of tie that in, because it seemed to me almost that you were, in a funny way, the panelist with the most affinity for resistance, which I wasn't expecting at all when you know, said you were kind of the orthodox Trotskyist panel, because, you know, like, for example, talking about the recent movement around sexual assault and these types of things, honestly, if I think about it, you know, what do I get from being able to get the guy who, like, said my tits were and I was fired? I don't know that I get that much from that. You know, is that sexual liberation for women? Is it liberation for workers? Where is that going, you know? And so I guess I wanted maybe some more clarification on that as well. And then, you know, I think this all ties into the broader question of political education. So sorry for being long-winded, but that is my question.
Sure. Okay. Well, I certainly agree that education and self-education is, or would be an important part of trying to, like, be an active force politically. I mean, it seems that the question is kind of what lessons does one actually draw from, like, what's happening. I mean, so for instance, like, actually what kind of sprang to mind, and maybe this is a little bit of a tangent, but was, you know, that, so, you know, with Bernie's run, one of the things that I learned from that was, you know, it wasn't like I was like, oh, like suddenly, like, you know, my politics are relevant or anything. I don't think that that's what that meant at all. What it made me think about was that, you know, when I was first kind of getting politicized around the sort of the end of the anti-war movement, like, that it was very common, I heard from many socialists, many like leftists who were involved in that like, well, you know, most people think that, like, the ideas in socialism are nice, but they're just, like, turned off by the word. And, you know, that, I don't think that that was actually true. Obviously, like, some things had changed in the meantime, but, like, what I kind of, like, learned from the whole thing with, like, Bernie is that actually the word socialism maybe was more taboo amongst the socialists and on the left than it was among people in general. And obviously, you know, the Soviet Union and McCarthyism, all these other things, they still cast a shadow, but I think that the left was holding itself back in ways that were not necessary. And so that was like a kind of peculiar, maybe, lesson that I took from it, but that's sort of what I took from it, rather than like, oh, some guy like said he was like a socialist and like people didn't like, you know, lynch him or something, so like that means that my politics are relevant. No, but it reveals something retrospectively for me about sort of even just in my own very recent past, the left. And so I guess for me, it feels like the most important lesson would be for the left to learn how it's holding itself back in ways that are not necessary. Obviously the circumstances aren't very great, so like there's a lot of objective limitations, but I think that there's also many limitations that are not objective, that are not, you know, that are self-imposed or self-limited. And I think the question would be how to identify those and try to overcome them practically. I feel like that would be maybe an important kind of first step in order to try to begin kind of at the beginning with political organizing. I don't know if that answers the question.
I have a daily complaint in my Facebook profile. The complaint is that I cannot accept more friends. I have 5,000 and 4,700 followers and 5,600 in a second page I have and 1,800 in a third page I have. I think education is to be bold and to be a full-time activist for whatever you believe and whatever you are for. But be out there. How many friends do you have in Facebook? If you have 300, you're wasting a fantastic means to educate people. Educate them on what? Well, educate them on what you believe. Or educate them on your opinion. It doesn't have to be on, you know, the truth of the truth and nothing but the truth according to all the left, because that doesn't exist. You exchange and give out your opinion and keep talking and keep arguing. Don't be a nuisance also, you know. There are people who post like you know, 75 things a day in Facebook and Instagram and, you know, 200 tweets. Well, that's not a good idea. But education, I think, it means keep transmitting your knowledge. And by the way, that's the other thing I want to touch on. The problem is, what is your ideal or your objective for your life? And the other one is what I call the real reality. Everybody here is going to work for 40 or 45 years of their lives. True? I mean, I don't think anybody's got enough money to retire today. Do you know your rights as a worker? I don't think so. Nobody does, except people who go to law school. No. Other than that, nobody knows their basic rights. You cannot organize anybody in your workplace if you don't know what your rights are in the workplace. You don't know how to act, how to react, how to confront the employer, how to create that workers' organization that is blah, 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 one day lead to revolution. You cannot organize it in your workplace because you don't know what rules you are subjected to. So get educated. You know, it's there's no other way. You have to educate yourself on so many things, but basically on the real reality. I think more people know their rights as tenants than their rights as workers. You know, but not everybody's a tenant. I mean, one person signs the contract, and the other 3 or 4 that maybe together don't sign it. Yeah, but everybody works pretty much, and nobody knows their rights as workers. So educate yourself and then continuously transmit your knowledge and your opinion and be out there and be bold. Be an activist, be a full-time activist, regardless of the time you work. I mean, sometimes you can be an activist at work too, but be an activist and just be there, you know, keep creating movement, basically.
What's Facebook? My dad's
So,
yeah. I want to answer your question as directly as I can. So, what's your name?
Erin.
Erin? The first thing is, I do think that you need to build a revolutionary party, which is like Trotsky's central idea, or at least eventually, once he gets to like the Fourth International. You skipped the first, right? That was like here, so come on. But anyway,
Trotsky was.
I know, that's right. So the question, I want to actually start there with the question of resistance and resisting things you need to learn. Like, I do kind of resist video games, like in my household, like somebody puts on the TV all the time and it really bugs the hell out of me, so I'm often resisting TV in order to like raid or whatever. So you can resist bad things. But I think that this is again a question of like, why do we talk about the working classes having power? And it's because your resistance is to your own exploitation, not to learning shit. It's different being a student. Like, am I exploiting my students? No, not really. It's not the same kind of relationship. Is my boss exploiting me? I mean, actually, my boss? Not exactly. Is your boss at Chipotle exploiting you? Yes. Right? So there's a working class, and there are people who are in that actual relationship where they have a certain type of power because of that relationship, if they can find a way to resist their own exploitation. That's kind of a vague, like, classical Marxist answer. But I do think that that actually does potentially get you to. That's the only way I think you can get to revolution. I mean, it's like the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, right? And so what are they demanding? They're demanding immediately what people want. Like, the main demand that gets the Bolsheviks into power is peace. End the war. Why do they say end the war? Because people are sick of the war. Ending the war is not an inherently revolutionary demand. Like, wars end without revolutionaries. But because you had a revolutionary party which made it very clear, the working class will have to take power to end the war now, they were able to make that idea clear to people. So I don't think you get a huge amount by getting the boss fired for like saying some sexist thing. But I think that if that's the thing that sparks people to start to fight, that's what you can get. I actually don't think you can get huge numbers of reforms that you keep permanently in capitalism. I don't. I think you can get reforms for now, and I think they're worth fighting for, and if you can improve some people's lives for a little while, that's totally worth doing. I'm not going to say, like, that sucks. But honestly, like, we've had reforms happen in this country 40 years ago, and they're gone. And they're going to keep going away. Like, that's the nature of where we are right now, because, like, capital can't make enough of a profit investing in the old ways, and it takes all the money out of the state in a million different ways. We see it in the city. We could go on the list that we all know about the problems that we face. So I don't think you're going to get reforms that stick. But I think you need to build an organization of people who see clearly that you need to get rid of capitalism. And you can express clearly when people fight, the working classes take power and run things ourselves in the interests of humanity, produce things to meet people's needs instead of for profit. And the only way you're going to get people to see that is if you link it to the fight people are making now. You can't just say it in an abstract way and expect people to go with socialism. I agree with you. I don't think most people in this country are socialists. I don't think most people know what the word means. And I think probably if the three of us wrote it down, we'd write very different things. Right? To me, it essentially means ordinary people running the society, and that includes the economy themselves. Okay. So to get there, people have to be able to fight for the things that they need right now. And I don't think you're going to get them in the system. I think the reason you need a revolution, and the reason you need socialism, is because this society is based on exploitation. It's based on, basically, sexual abuse. It's based on racism. These things are, like, deep in its DNA. And so if you're going to get rid of this system, you're going to have to start by fighting the actual problems people face. I don't know if that answers your question of education, but that's enough.
Since I have the microphone, I'm going to jump in, or
It's off. Okay. Just on Sam's last comment, you mentioned that if the three of you were to write down what you thought socialism was, you'd have three different answers. And Sam was given his definition. I'm just wondering if Nate and Jorge would do the same.
In very basic words, I think socialism would be effectively people running the country according to the interest of the working class. And that's going to sound awfully like Stalinism. But I have never understood the idea of Trotskyism, of people, in the abstract sense, running everything in the country without any kind of coordination. You need a government, you need a coordination, you need to have different levels of structure. So basically that's it. You know, socialism would be running the country on behalf, on favor of, according to the interest of a working class. We want specifics organized from top up, but that would be socialism. It's too abstract, really.
I just about just workers' control of the means of production, and I think that what gets trickier is thinking about what that would look like, or actually sort of like mean concretely, and how we would go about achieving that politically. And I think a party is necessary, but that, you know, there would be many simultaneous forms in which that kind of control would be needed in terms of society, and the party would be one way and a necessary way, but it wouldn't be like the only thing. It wouldn't be just like the party just literally controlling everything, and that and you know, there's that would be the very short answer, I guess. I don't know if that's
Yeah, but my question is prompted by something you, Sam, had said in your initial remarks regarding, you know, what it means to actually have a movement, and that how nowadays we don't really quite have a movement in the same way that we had in the 30s, and then you also mentioned the 60s and 70s. And I was just asking for some clarification in terms of what you mean by that, and how that, you know, the movements in the 30s and then subsequently in the 60s and 70s were different than what we have now. I mean, when the Iraq War broke out, that was one of the largest protests in human history. And the other question I wanted to ask is why you singled out the 30s and then the 60s and 70s as opposed to maybe the 1890s, the 1840s, you know, the prior history. Because I think those were qualitatively different. You know, there's kind of a long historical trajectory to those. And why do you think, you know, what we have now is different than what we had before?
I like the question. I feel remiss, since I'm like formally sort of a 19th century historian, for not mentioning the 1890s. I just mentioned the 60s and 30s because they were more recent and people are more familiar with them. That's the only reason. I wouldn't disagree with your point on that. As far as what made it different, I'm going to quote somebody. I recently-ish, maybe a year ago, I don't know if anybody else was at this, at UIC, they had a speech by Albert Woodfox, who was one of the Angola Three. He was like in solitary confinement for 40 years. And he came out. It was actually a really moving speech. His voice was very low, but he was a very powerful speaker. And so somebody asked him, what were you most surprised by when you came out? And it was one of these questions where they're expecting him to say like Facebook or, you know, the internet or something. And he said two things. The first one was he was surprised by the fact that the election of Obama hadn't changed anything, because he'd heard about the election of Obama, and then he was like, oh man, like New Orleans looks like even worse than it was when I went in. He was from Louisiana, right? And then the other one was that people are not willing to actually make sacrifices. And I think that's actually where you get to what a movement is. Like in the 30s, you had not more people necessarily active than are active now, but those people were like actually risking their jobs and their lives in a time period of losing your job could mean that you're going to actually starve. And in the 60s, you see a similar thing. You saw, actually at first, many fewer people than those marches against the Iraq War, right? I went to some of those Iraq War marches, and they were, some of them, much bigger than any of the anti-Vietnam War movement marches, although I'm actually mostly not talking about Vietnam. And you see where the black movement started. It was actually small. Like you look at something like the Freedom Rides, already in 61, which is many years in, and you're talking about a few dozen people, but those people are about to maybe get killed. And now I'm not saying what we should do is go get killed, right? But I think that it makes a really big difference if what you're talking about are people who are in college, who are going to stay in college, and who are going to go to a protest, and are then going to maybe even skip class one day, but not 2 days. Versus people who are actually putting their entire privilege, maybe not their lives, because people don't want to die, but their privilege really on the line. Like, to give you this freedom rider as an example, and again, I'm not like a nonviolent activist, I'm not holding up like we should go back to Martin Luther King days. There was an interesting event there, right? If you remember the story, the freedom riders get arrested, their boss is bombed, they're all like in jail. And then like Diane Nash and a bunch of people at Fisk University are like, shit, we're about to graduate. Almost all of them are like the first people in their families to go to college. And like dozens of them are like, we're going down to Mississippi and we're going to make sure the freedom rides are completed. And they do not graduate from college. The president of the college says, if you do this, you're out of here. They give up their 4 years of tuition and their potential privilege. And that kept it going and they kind of succeeded. And you just don't see stuff like that in the same way anymore. At least I don't. Maybe, hopefully it is happening somewhere and I'm just not aware of it. But it strikes me that the size of a movement, the size of a march, is much less relevant to its strength than what it's coming up against. I also think another part of it is part of what Jorge said at the beginning, which is we see people making demands in a very abstract way, like end the war, I'm all for it. But did anybody actually think that like we were going to end the war? I mean, I didn't, and people I work with didn't either, right? We're doing something that's very abstract here. And I think when you're doing something that has the possibility of winning, when you're like shutting down the main GM plant, and we're going to sit here for 40 days, and we're going to fight the police and the National Guard, and we're not leaving until you give us a contract, okay? It's not a revolution, but it's a movement on the scale of nothing we're seeing today. That's what I think it is.
Can I add to that 1 second? I think somewhere, I'm not from here, but somewhere in the United States, the tradition to fight got lost. You see the big movements in the 30s that were really fights, in that sense, risking a whole lot of things. I mean, you were coming out of an economic recession, depression, and people were basically willing to risk their jobs. And that tradition of fighting is gone. The 60s was a very different thing. It was way more abstract. I mean, going to an anti-Vietnam War demonstration, you didn't risk much, really. It's totally different. But the workplace fighting, and I always put the workplace in the center of the fight, the social fight, because if it's not in the workplace, where? At home? In your barrio? Yeah, sure, but what are you risking, really? The basis of your life is the workplace. That's where you depend and where you really live and make a living. And the tradition to fight got lost. History doesn't exist.
Thanks for speaking. I think it's really interesting whenever I hear socialists talk because they sound extremely moralistic to me. So then when they criticize like resistance or like, I'm not in support of Antifa as like moralistic. That's kind of funny to me because now you're talking about sacrifice. But yeah, I think that is true though, that people are not willing to sacrifice. I feel like I've sacrificed a lot of, and I'm experiencing the effects of that. But I think for me, it's because I continue to do it because my life is more interesting and worth living. So I think it's too bad that you can't focus on that. And I think like I'm more of an anarchist, and so I like have a lifestyle that I live that's about resistance. I feel like, but I do it because I enjoy it and because it's what I desire. And there's also like, I think people, that's like the key to it too, is I feel like, what do you get for like complying with the system nowadays? You get $12 an hour or something like that, something ridiculous. You get nothing. And you just get the next job. So I think, I think that's really important. I also think about, Jorge, you ran for like a position in Pilsen. I lived in Pilsen then. And I think about how like Carlos Rosa got elected. He's a little bit of a different candidate, but I was wondering if like, I feel like the difference between that was that people, that like he appealed like sort of in like people's desires and how he spoke about his campaign, and obviously it was a different historical moment, but like, I don't know, I guess, what does this imply for like how you talk about what you want? That's my question, and also a lot of statements.
Takes a sec for this to come live. I've run twice for office, pretty much with the same purpose, both. I ran for the US Congress in 2009 in the Democratic Party primary, and many people criticized me for that. Oh, so you're a Democrat. No, I'm not a Democrat. You don't need to be a Democrat, and you don't need to do anything with the Democratic Party to participate in a Democratic Party primary. It's just an election. But I did it because we wanted to have an electoral point, to make an electoral point for the immigration movement. You know, just having a candidate out of the immigration movement in the electoral arena, we thought that was important. And what was my sacrifice? That I was the stupid guy willing to do that, you know. And it cost me 3 years of my life because I was blacklisted, I couldn't get a job anywhere, I was banned in labor unions, I was banned in the city of Chicago, I was banned everywhere. I mean, I survived, you know, selling calendars that I printed myself and a whole bunch of other things. Then I ran for alderman in Pilsen, and that Hershey ran. He was my opponent, or I was his opponent. We both in the left. We were on the left side of the candidates. We both lost, of course. We divided the votes of the left. But that had a purpose. And the purpose was to bring up the word socialist, you know, to the forefront. I didn't think ever that we could win, honestly. Carlos Rosa thought that he could win, and he never brought up the word socialist in his campaign. We had a meeting, and at that meeting, Carlos Rosa told us, very naive, honest, you know, I am not going to declare that I am a socialist because I think I have a chance to win. Okay, and he won. And after winning, he declared himself a socialist. Fine, that's good. I mean, that was his strategy. He made it. Ed, I don't think you ever declared you were a socialist. Running publicly.
I said we were running as a working class candidate.
Right. So the point of my campaign was to say, yes, you know, socialism exists. There are socialists, and we have a saying. There is a space for the left, or there should be a space of the left of socialists to run for office in the city of Chicago. A year and a half after that, Bernie runs, you know, brings up the word socialist nationwide, and in Pilsen, Bernie won in some polling places by 82% against Hillary Clinton. 82% for the socialist guy running, where we had run 1.5 years before. I think that was the point of the campaign, you know, not to win. I didn't think I would be any good in any government capacity. But the point was that it was an education, or part of education too. You know, not only the word, but what socialism means. What socialism would mean at the level of the barrio. You know, what socialism would mean for you in this block. What socialism would mean for you, blah, 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 etc., 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 regarding taxes, regarding housing, regarding transportation, which Carlos Rosa didn't do. Now he's the socialist candidate against the popular candidate who's always been a Democratic independent, you know, independent Democrat, Chuy Garcia, for the US Congress. That's real politics, and it's incredibly complicated, you know. When we talk about building the party, well, You have now the largest socialist party, the DSA, running a candidate against a candidate who's going to win and who's always been an independent Democrat and widely respected in the Latino community. But well, that's politics. It stinks.
I just wanted to say one more quick thing about Ed's campaign, which I helped with, which is interesting because it does kind of get a little bit of this left question versus class question. Because the reason we decided to do this really was because of the teacher strike. He's a teacher, and it was to say, you're not going to get anything by having somebody elected. And we said clearly, like, look, if he won, which we knew he wasn't going to win either, that would have been kind of terrible, being in the city council meetings and stuff, but then what are you going to do? You're going to use the resources of the office to help people fight. That's all you can do. But that is something. And what you're saying then is, if you're not ready to fight, don't vote for me because I can't do it with you. That's how you get to people's interests. I mean, that's the...
I would, just to, I guess, respond. I think it's unfortunate we didn't have someone from a more kind of anarchist kind of perspective on the panel. Actually, I think that would have been interesting. But I mean, and I agree very much that I agree that any rebirth, vibrant left movement, it wouldn't just be based on like demanding the most from people, demanding there'd be a sense that people are getting something out of it. I think that's important. I think that people need to feel that they're learning things, that they're that there's a sense that it's actually building towards something. You can it doesn't do people really good. They just sort of say like, well, like socialism would be great, and like here's what you have to do. Here's like a giant like stack of flyers and go out and like hand them out for like 20 hours or whatever. And that's obviously not a sustainable way of organizing people. It's and there's a lot of that on the left. I mean, the left just sometimes just isn't very pleasant to be around. I mean, that's like a 1 minute. I mean, the rare exceptions up here. But I mean, in general, it's like it's sort of like it kind of has a kind of subcultural existence that's not always very pleasant. It can be extremely depressing, in fact. And that's that's something that it'd be important to try to change, I think, and to actually have people feel that there's something positive they're getting out of this and out of their experiences organizing. I think that's something that actually maybe we don't think about enough on the left. I guess the point I would maybe also, since we're both talking about campaigns, I mean, I guess maybe I'm kind of asking a question here. I mean, it seems like both of you were thinking about running sort of through the Democratic Party in order to kind of, not even necessarily expecting that you were going to win, you were kind of trying to do it to attain a better platform to kind of like make an art. Is that fair, or to kind of try to make a statement or a point and use it for kind of a specific kind of tactical goal or for a kind of educational goal? And I guess I'd just be interested in asking like how, do you think that was successful? Do you think it was a mistake? Or do you think that, I mean, how do you kind of feel about that in terms of how it actually played out? Especially as you were saying, when you ran, you ended up facing a ton of resistance and ended up being a big problem. You faced resistance from labor unions themselves. And, I guess, what did you feel that was gotten out of it, or what would you have done differently? I guess would just be something I'd be interested in hearing about.
I would run an incredibly more organized campaign if the intention was to win. And there are places where you win by running in the Democratic primary, not in the general election. That's a myth of the left, or some left, that, oh yeah, but you have to run as an independent candidate. Get out of town. You don't know what you're talking about. The 4th Congressional Congress district, where Chuy Garcia is going to run. In a general election, Democrat, just because he's a Democrat, gets 92% of the vote. So, if you give me $1 million, you know, and give me 300 people in the street, you know, then I would run as an independent. But nobody's going to give me $1 million for running against a Democrat in the 4th Congressional District of Illinois. Forget it. You have to win the primary. If you win the primary, automatically you win the general election. Oh no, but you're going to run as a Democrat. You don't have to sign anything. You don't have to pledge anything. You don't have to sit down with anybody in the Democratic Party to run in the Democratic Party primary. It's a name. It's an election. You know, you don't have to cut your veins and sign on blood for anything. It's just an election. That's it. And the day you win, you can declare you're independent. That's exactly what Carlos Rosa did. Who cares? It's the election you have to win. If you believe you can win the general election, go for it. I'll support you. But I don't think general elections are winnable in most districts of the United States. That's it.
We didn't run as a Democrat. We ran an nonpartisan.
Yeah,
but whatever. I don't want to say anything more. I'm curious about your question.
Oh, okay. So this is kind of in response to something you said, Sam. When you were talking about reforms, I noticed that you were kind of talking about them in terms of like results. In other words, like achieving the demands of the reforms. And I was wondering about like, and this question might also be directed to like Jorge because you have experience with union organizing. You know, thinking about reforms not necessarily in terms of results, but in terms of like developing, like workers developing their activity and their practice in a political context. And, you know, sort of the experience of like not only, you know, organizing and like kind of like positive side of experience, but also like negatively, like coming up against the limitations of reforms, like, and recognizing those limitations. And so like, Jorge, like, what do you think, how do you think that like the people you work with in, you know, unions when you're organizing, like how do they understand their experience when they're, you know, demanding reforms or, you know, doing union activity? Do they see it as, are they thinking about it, you know, like mostly in terms of results or in terms of like developing their practice?
Not only labor unions. I work in a nonprofit, of course. Rise Chicago is a worker center, and our famous motto is that we don't serve anybody. We don't provide anybody with services. If you have a problem in the workplace, we will support your campaign. We will educate you on what to do, how to do it, when to do it, and etc., how to get more co-workers involved, and then we will give you advice. We are not attorneys, but whatever knowledge of the law we have, we will give it to you, we will provide it to you, we will bring people in your support, etc., etc. My particular job is to try to organize groups of workers into labor unions, of course. And if you do it that way, the way we do it, you educate the workers in such a way that when they get organized into a labor union, they already know many times more than the union organizers and more than the business reps of the labor unions, because it's the campaign they have led. You know, they organize, they lead their campaigns, they call their meetings, and they know their rights, and they know the labor law, and they know the FSLA, and they know how the NLRB works, and the blah blah blah. Really, some union organizers are not as well educated as the members of Rise Chicago. But that's not the very, you know, the most extended experience. Most workers who are members of a labor union are disappointed in their labor union, because there's this idea that I pay dues and the union is something out there, you know, some guy who comes by every other month and, you know, gets together with the employer and then he leaves, and that's the union. So that's another kind of education campaign. You know, you are the union, you have the right to run the union, to go to your meetings, and we always ask, you know, when is the next general union meeting? People don't know. What is your union? I think Local 30 of what union? They don't know what union they belong to. So there is, I think, part of the corruption system in the labor unions, has led to that, to become a sort of a kind of work insurance, for their members, and that's it. There is no internal education to really run the unions as working class organizations that should be moving forwards, etc., etc. They are in the defensive. They are resisting, precisely.
I'm not going to jump into the whole union thing. I think a lot of unions operate somewhat differently, and some of the unions that we're active in, they're a little bit more, people know what they're in. Like if you're talking about a UAW or something, people definitely know they're in UAW, and depending on which
I am a
place,
UAW member.
okay.
Be careful.
In auto plants. Okay.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, I mean, yes, I totally agree with basically what you said. Where I think that your question is really interesting is this point about people fighting for practical problems, people fighting for material reforms versus fighting to change their consciousness. I don't think people fight and become active in order to gain consciousness. In my experience, the problems that bring people to be angry or to talk to me, if I'm in the workplace or whatever, are often very, very small, very practical problems, like there's no toilet paper in the bathroom, or they said they were going to give us a bonus this day and they gave it to us another day, or whatever. They're taking away a paid holiday. I mean, right now, people's whole way of viewing the world is extremely narrow, and I think it's because there's no broader political movement or political perspective. But I think that actually the most important thing people gain from a fight is not the material things. It is, in fact, that consciousness and it's that sense of resistance. And I think the most important thing workers won in the 1930s was not the unions, it was not the Wagner Act, it was not Social Security, it was that for a whole period there was a sense that the bourgeoisie was afraid of their workers, that workers had a sense of their own power and would go on strike or would resist in all kinds of smaller ways. And that, they thought they could win, they knew they could win, they knew they had to do it together, they had had some experience doing it, and they won a lot of material things as a consequence. Right? But I think you're right, actually, that's the most important reform. It's just not usually called a reform. So I like that question.
So this is for me. So I want you to tell us if you feel different than Joy's experience of quote-unquote doing it for something along the lines of substance. Given the fact that you're in two memberships, one having historical baggage and significance, and the other having a sort of generous character in the present historical moment, in the sense that you're in two orgs that have a relationship to an aspiration of coming into being, and in the sense that if they do come into being, that would sort of give substance to the word socialism.
Yeah, I mean, it. I haven't been a member of the SPUSA for very long. It's still feels very new, and I feel that there's a lot that I've learned, and I do feel that, and obviously there's a great deal that I've learned through Platypus, and I don't think I would be in the SPUSA if I hadn't, I really actually became I wasn't really political very much like really in college. It was actually kind of more of a post-college phenomenon. I was actually radicalized through Platypus and at the same time that the sort of very, very tail end of the kind of anti-war movement. So, yeah, I mean, I kind of view my work or what I would want to do through activism in the SPUSA as actually trying to build or try to create a kind of political context in which, and then maybe this is also too why I'm sort of using the word left, like actually trying to create a context in which, it's the SPUSA is a multi-tendency party, and it would potentially be a place where, ideally, people who are from other tendencies on the left who are talented organizers and who have experience could actually broaden their work, could actually try to do more. That's like the ideal, and that hasn't happened yet, and it would be a very kind of like long process. In terms of like day to day, what keeps me going with that, I have other things too. I'm happily married and stuff, so I have it's personal stuff that I'm happy about. But in terms of like my activism work, is that I do feel that I'm learning through this, and very different types of lessons than what I learned through Platypus, but that I'm learning something, and that's been enough of a positive incentive that it's sort of kept me committed. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, I guess I was more so concerned with sort of like differences in terms of like abstractions, like qualitative, quantitative, how you sort of operate that politically through both of these things, and also like question of like in Platypus there's a question of can this be a political movement, and sort of like the framework we have here is like there is always politics, but in the sense that you sort of have, I feel like have to sort of operate in the apolitical and the political. Maybe.
Yeah, I think that's. I do think that. So I do think that Platypus is doing something. It has a very kind of limited and modest, in my view, goal or sort of purpose, and it doesn't sort of engage in sort of typical activist work. It's more of a sort of looking at the history of the left and trying to kind of use that and to understand ideological obstacles that the currently existing left is sort of grappling with, sometimes consciously or semi-consciously, which is a very abstract sort of thing. It's kind of like more of like an intellectual project and an educational one. But I think it's actually very valuable, and it's actually been helpful for me. Sort of training that education has been that kind of apolitical kind of, as you put it, education has actually been helpful for me in terms of my activism work. In terms of like exactly how I still feel like there's a lot that I'm kind of trying to figure out. I don't know.
What are the obstacles? You guys, it seems like all of you have sort of fallen back on. You've all described yourself as essentially in this position of resistance, hoping for reform, right? You've all described yourself as, you've described yourself as essentially operating on the level of a propaganda group, and you're sort of like this activist who's been left out on his own, operates through various organizations, whether it's Arise or your union work, but you ultimately feel like have been. The question of how that's organized, right? I think what's being left out here is the question of a party. What are the obstacles to actually developing a party? And we can't just say that it's just like people don't know and we need to educate people, right? It's like there are some like practical obstacles, and I think the question perhaps to push against the issue of the working class versus the left is that for me, the left is actually largely responsible for the obstacles, for the miseducation that happens. That it's the question of whether the Democratic Party can actually represent the left, whether someone like Carlos Rosa, who runs as a Democrat and calls himself a socialist, or Bernie Sanders, right? And there not being any sort of like organizational apparatus for clarifying what that would even mean in the present. I think that's at least my perspective, but I wanted to know like where you guys are coming from practically and ideologically on that.
We're running out of time, so maybe we'll take, if there's any one last question, closing remark, can we hold it into the
Maybe we can try to answer that or answer both and try to wrap
That is one of the problems. why would we have a time limit to discuss very important things?
Thought you had to go somewhere.
I do have to.
Yeah, I should have left like 5 minutes ago.
So I guess I want to ask what is in simple terms just the question, why wouldn't you want to win some sort of elected office or some sort of campaign? But to maybe contextualize it a bit, some of the things I'm thinking about are, for example, how you talked about the movements in the 30s and 60s and how people at this time, they sacrificed something, or they were willing, there were stakes, they were willing to kind of put up some of their life for it. But what that actually reminded me of is something Jorge said at the very beginning about how one needs to be able to negotiate, not just demand things. And it seems to me that negotiation involves, having stakes, being willing to sacrifice something, but also being able to bargain and having something of your own that you can bring to the table. And so I'm reminded of, just because I was listening to this interview that a member of Platypus, Chris Mitrani, had done with Bill Peltz, who passed recently. And he was talking about Debs and the Socialist Party of the 19th century. And there's this part where he starts talking about how they ran a candidate to run the police. And once he got that office, what he was able to do is stop the police from shutting down strikes. Right. So, going for these, or, they ran somebody for the assessor, right, the county assessor, so that they could assess these big corporate, properties owned by capitalists, factories, whatever, at a higher fair rate, all these sorts of things. And then, they were able from that not only to build support for these different electoral campaigns, but also a whole apparatus, the likes of which we kind of see in the Democratic Party, right? Like they have, you could go to them and find some NGO, they could run a summer camp, stuff like that. So the Socialist Party was doing it. And so you're able to build all these different things because you have something to negotiate with. And so I guess my question is, why are we looking back at the movements of the 30s and 60s and not earlier, which kind of came up earlier when Jacob asked it, but I want to pose the question again. Because I think this is about the question of resistance versus reform. Something that we might say differentiates reform and revolution from mere resistance is that, instead of the workers just resisting exploitation, they want to organize their own exploitation. They want to be the ones who control the means of production and organize their exploitation to make a socialist world. Something like that. And I don't want to go on too long because Joe's question's really important too, so please also answer his. I talked too long, sorry.
Okay, let's start very fast. I have a theory. It's proven to be correct, I think, most of the times. If you really want to change something, you have to start by creating such a problem that has to be solved. I think if we want, let's say, immigration reform, what we have to do is to create such a headache for the politicians, for the people who have to actually vote in Congress to change the law. You have to create such a problem that they wake up every day with a big headache saying, we have to do this. We have to stop the marches in the streets. We have to stop the days without immigrants. We have to stop the strikes of immigrants. We have to stop the immigrants getting arrested every other day in civil disobediences in front of the Capitol. And, we have to stop these people sitting in the corner of Monroe and State Avenue in Chicago. That's my way to see things. That's my formula. But they are going to vote. Unless you believe that you can replace, all bad congressmen and replace them with good Democrats, blah, 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 good congressmen. No, the Republicans in charge right now. You have to create such a headache for them that they have to solve the problem and they have to solve it in your favor. You are not going to necessarily bargain, negotiate with them. You're going to threaten them. You have to threaten them with paralyzing this goddamn country. That's what you have to do, I think. Now, what's the problem with the left and organizing the left party? The problem is the left. I come from a long tradition of merging leftist parties in Mexico. 5 parties agreed to self-dissolve in order to merge and create another party, and 3 years later they repeated the process to merge with other 6 parties, and then 3 years later they decided to do it again, and 6 years later they decided to do it for the final time. So like 25 different leftist organizations ended up being what we today know as the PRD, the Partido de la Revolución Democrática, Democratic Party, Party for the Democratic Revolution. Now it's split, of course, because corruption got to it and whatnot. That's my tradition. So what's the problem? What's the biggest problem to create a leftist party in the United States? The left! Because, we won't talk to those guys, They want to reform the Democratic Party. Oh no, we won't talk to the Trotskyists. Oh no, we won't talk to, Because in 1929, Leon Trotsky said this. Who gives a damn about what Leon Trotsky said in 1929 about the other fraction of the three-way split? Yeah, the minority expelled the majority? Sure, it happens all the time. The biggest problem is the lack of willingness to sit down in the national conventions of the ISO, name it. Yeah, and say one point in the agenda in the national convention is going to be how do we sit down with other parties and merge and agree on something, to create a bigger, larger structure and forget about what Trotsky said in 1929.
Well, I care about what Trotsky said. Of course. But what's interesting, I think, to me is that, I don't think it quite breaks down as easily as sort of splitting is bad. Because there's actually different historical moments where that was proven to be necessary. In other words, a split actually preceded greater and more effective political action. Now, of course, in what happened, so then people in much later, in the 1970s, many groups were looking back to that history and just thought that if there's a split going on, then that's in other words, there's from different moments in the history of the left, there's times when splits are actually part of a kind of political dynamism that's playing out organizationally, that's actually building towards something. And then there's also moments in the history of the left, at other times, where that's just part of a process of kind of disintegration and decay. So I agree that the obstacle, in a sense, is actually is actually the left itself. I find that the history of the left is a way of trying to bringing some clarity to that and kind of orienting with respect to that. So one issue that kind of try to maybe wrap up a couple of different things. We've talked about sort of lack of clarity, a lack of a tradition of fighting, cynicism about politics, a lot of these other things, and I wouldn't say that all those things are the reason why the left is weak. I would say that all of those things are phenomena that exist socially because for a long time the left has been weak, and there's been a very long period. In the 1960s, all these different movements didn't actually succeed in creating a viable, independent political party, a viable third party, and I think that was ultimately a huge liability, a huge problem in subsequent decades. And that, in a sense, when I was speaking about trying to kind of rebuild from mostly, if not entirely from scratch, trying to rebuild an independent party, that we're actually not just starting from square one or even square zero, but actually negative. It feels like, because there's actually a history of problems that have kind of been not adequately addressed or resolved that do weigh on the present. And I think that's issue is how to kind of address that. And I don't have a kind of a practical plan fully worked out for how to do that, but I do think that that's how the left has to kind of work through an impasse. And that would mean the left becoming something very, very different than what it is now. I think that the left has to very fundamentally change before it's any hope of like, leading greater changes in society. And so the question is sort of how does one try to bring about a greater clarity in the present? And there's different, I think, potentially different ways to do that, but I think that's kind of the issue that at least I'm trying to wrap my head.
I'm going to try to take these in reverse order. And I never did say that I enjoy my life, but I do. I'm not married, but I do have a Chiweenie. It's very cute, except that she's cancer, and that's terrible, but you know. But I also am like an activist and like doing that work. It's not like I do it because I feel guilty or I'm making a sacrifice and whatever. No, I'm doing what I want to do with my life and I have to do that. But I do what I want to do and I want to do it because I cannot make peace with the society. It's not because I actually love on a minute-to-minute basis what I'm doing. And I think if we reduce it to, you got to make it fun to go to a socialist party meeting and have pizza, then we're not actually building anything, right? Like I get up really early in the morning and stand outside often to do this work. It's not like fun, right? It's cold. I have like boots. I do it because I think what I'm doing is meaningful because I can't make peace with the society. Okay, let me keep moving. The reason why I said that we were kind of glad we didn't win is not because we don't want to eventually win. It's because we didn't actually have the forces in real life to pull that off. So like if Ed was alderman, or if Jorge was alderman, alone on that city council, like you can say a lot of stuff, and it would actually be really interesting, but you're not going to be able to do the things you're talking about from the early 20th century. And this relates to actually my reason for invoking the 30s and the 60s and not the early Socialist Party, although I think there's a lot there that we can draw from. And it's because I think that actually the Russian Revolution in many ways clarified some key questions, probably where we basically disagree, although I don't want to have some sectarian argument. But I do think it clarified some things, right? Like, I think ultimately, like, the people who became Social Democrats were really on the wrong side. And Debs himself never quite clarified where he stood. And a lot of people in the Socialist Party of the USA who did those things most successfully, like Milwaukee and stuff, were ultimately people who really made peace with the society and integrated themselves into it and blocked people from fighting and thought you could change things by using this state. I think you have to demand things from the state. I think you have to negotiate with the state. I think you have to shut stuff down and cause them problems. I don't think you can build socialism with this state. I think you're going to have to use a state. So I don't think it's going to be like, I'm not an anarchist exactly, sorry. But anyway, so that's why I invoke things since the Russian Revolution, because I think some things are clear. Let me go to the question of the party. In this part, actually, deeply disagree with both of you. First of all, I don't think the problem is that we just need to get together. Like, in the political activity that I actually do, I basically never meet another leftist. And when I do, we're basically friendly and kind of often doing sort of pushing in more or less sort of the same direction, maybe with some different tactics. And if we got together, we would still be totally irrelevant. And I think in the places where you've had mergers on the left that have even taken power, like in Greece with Syriza, what you saw was they compromised to the point that they were trying to use that bourgeois state, that was also like a totally fucked bourgeois state, to solve the problems of the people in Greece, and they couldn't do it, even though they took power in that state. So if we did that, we couldn't solve the problems either. I don't think the problem is the left needs to come together. I don't think that's how you build a political party, is that we can all just pretend we don't disagree. I think we should each, if we think this is a way to organize something and make a fight, do it. And the proof is ultimately in the pudding. And the reason why the left, I think, is very divided is because there's not enough pudding. Like, I think that the way we need to build things is a certain way, which I'm not going to get into, because this is our closing remarks right now, right? But I think you got to rest on the workers themselves. I don't think you can do it through union apparatus, blah, 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 blah. If anybody wants to talk about that more later, I'd be happy to. But I don't think that is in contradiction to what Jorge is doing. And when people start to fight and there's enough places where we can actually intervene, then you can do something. So Ed is active in the teachers union. Is he like the enemy of all the ASO people in the teachers union and tell people you should join Spark instead of ISO? That would be ridiculous. Like, the question is, here's a problem right now. We're confronted with this contract. We're confronted with this problem in our school. What do we do about it? And a lot of the time we're doing the same things. And some of the time we see a slightly different way to do it, and they do it their way. So I think the reason why there's no political party is partially that, but I want to say one more thing about it. And this is the thing which I think separates the history of the left in the US from the history of the left in Europe. I think in poor countries, it's a somewhat different problem. But between the US and Europe, I think the key difference, I do not think it's that the working class here has fought less hard. I just don't think that's true. I think it's because in every major country in Europe, and I don't know the history of every country, but you've had a layer of educated middle-class people who decide to align themselves with working class and play a role in building political parties linked to the working class. And with few rare exceptions, that's happened much less here. And if you want to go to Trotsky, I think the Trotskyist movement is in many ways stillborn. And it's stillborn, even though I'm concerned as a part of it. It's stillborn because it's born in a moment when the working class is completely in retreat. It's born in reaction to the victory of Hitler and the collapse of the Communist Party in Germany. And so it's not built at a time when workers are fighting back. Okay, yeah, there's strikes in the US and stuff. There's a Spanish Civil War, fine. It's built at a time when workers are really in retreat. And so who does it get? It gets a bunch of intellectuals who, in generally, except for the US, have very few connections with the working class. So if you have 20 intellectuals in a room, and they have no working class work anyway, and they disagree, and you split into 5 versus 15, why not? Right? But if you actually had built something that had some weight, that was actually carrying out activity, you're much less likely to split. I think this is actually why the history of the Communist parties in a lot of countries in the world, who have, from my perspective, in many ways, terrible politics, but they're much more in sync than the working class. They're much more stable. They're able to do much more, and that makes people less likely to quit and to split and to move away. Because why are you going to go from a party in France that's a few 100,000 people, that's really leading the union, that's leading all these fights, to build your own tiny little group? So I think the way that you build a party does partially depend on what's happening in society. And my view is, figure out what you think makes the most sense. Work with people who agree with you as best they can. Try to build what you think makes sense to build right now, and it's going to be small. Until there's some kind of fight on a big enough scale that masses of people are actually thinking about these things. Because right now they're not. When I go and sell my paper, people are pretty friendly. A lot of people will stop, more than you might think. Not all the time, depends where you go. Right? Like, we did some of this electoral work in Michigan recently, trying to get a working class party on the ballot, a new party. And I got a lot of signatures. It was super easy. When I was on the street saying to people in a working class area, white or black, there's not a lot of non-white or black people in there. Like, do you think, I think workers need their own party. Will you sign this petition, get a new party, a working class party on the ballot that says all those things I said earlier? Man, most people signed. And you could go to these places that voted for Trump in like, Macomb County and stuff, and most people signed. People are fine with that. That doesn't mean they're going to do anything. They're not fighting. They're not going to build that working class party themselves. They're happy to sign my petition. That's it. And until people are ready to take up a banner themselves, then there's no proof of my ideas versus Jorge ideas versus Nate's ideas. We're all putting out there what we think makes sense and seeing what sticks, and not much is sticking in real life. So I think we should keep doing with that. I don't actually think the problem of the left is the left. I don't think that's why we don't have a party. I mean, I disagree with the new left, ultimately. I don't think that's why we don't have a political party in the working class, or a revolutionary party, a socialist party, whatever you want to call it. I do not think that's why we don't have it. I think it's for a much deeper reason about what's the situation we're in, and whether that layer of intellectuals actually decided to make links with people outside of the working class. And until you get a layer of people who do that, I mean a layer, not 5 people, you're not going to have a political party.
Yeah, thank you.